Thank you, Ron, and thank you, Janet, and thank you all for coming. It's such a privilege to meet the blood kin of the man that we honor today. And it shows you how short the history of the country really is, that they stand here with us at this moment. What part can the average person play in their own tumultuous times? Dr. Briggs may have a lesson for us today in our own. And that is the story of today. First, some veils to part. The War of 1812 has been called by one major historian, Joshua Smith, unwanted, unnecessary, and unfortunate. For Maine, one word says it all: disaster. If you were to add three more, they would be defeated, demoralized, and occupied by the enemy. Now why? Why a war at all, as every veteran will ask? Well, the young war hawks in the United States Congress wanted war. Henry Clay, John Calhoun. The United States was a young adolescent, flexing its young muscles. You make all your best decisions when you're an adolescent, don't you? Well, the British Navy was stopping United States ships and forcing our sailors into the British Navy. British Navy would Shanghai United States merchant ships on the high seas and loot them. So the war was for, quote, free trade and sailors' rights. Hardly a bumper sticker slogan there, but off to war we went, June 1812. The British Navy had 1,100 plus ships. The United States Navy had maybe 11. But the United States had Preble's boys. And that is a generation that was trained in the hard life at sea and the skills of wind and water by Commodore Edward Preble of Portland, Maine, the commander of Old Ironsides itself, the USS Constitution. He was the original Iron Man, and he rests right over there. I can just see the top of his stone from here, and I imagine that he is looking on today's proceedings with approval. He trained Isaac Hall. He trained Thomas McDonough. He trained Stephen, my country right or wrong, Decatur. Now, Master Commander Thomas McDonough is one of Preble's boys. Captain Thomas McDonough's flagship is the SS Saratoga, and the Saratoga is Dr. Briggs' ship. So in September 1814, Dr. Briggs probably sat surrounded by spars, by hammers and saws at work, piles of rope at Plattsburgh, New York, Western Shore, Lake Champlain. If he thought about the war thus far, in which he was now to play a part, this is what he would have remembered. In 1813, the American Army had captured Toronto, Canada, and burned it to the ground. All right, say the British. August 1814, they capture Washington and burn the Capitol and burn the White House. In July 1814, the British landed in Eastport, Maine. They captured Maine without a shot. Bangor ran the white flag out to meet the British troops as they advanced. And the British declare plans to make Maine, all of Maine, east of the Penobscot, into a province of Canada, which they called New Ireland. Nova Scotia means New Scotland, so New Ireland. The American Army at Hampton, when they saw the British arrive marching over the hill, flags flying, drummers beating, bagpipes skirling, turned and ran. The British right of the Battle of Hampton: never have men with arms in their hands made such good use of their legs, unquote. So quite the news from home. The war is hugely unpopular here in New England. In September 1814, the British land and sea forces planned to seize all the territory around the Great Lakes, the great inland seas, and drive like a dart down Lake Champlain and isolate New York and New England from the rest of the United States, declare the nation split and victory complete. And they're nearly there. The Vermonters are very glad to sell flour and goods to the British side. Mainers are very glad to sell beef and produce to the British side. The very day of the naval battle of Plattsburgh, Mainers are lining up in Eastport, raising their hand to take the oath of loyalty to the King of England for the second time in 2 generations. So, Thursday, September 11th, 1814, if Dr. Briggs had any of this news from home, he would have been aboard the Saratoga. Commander MacDonough lines up his 4 ships and his little craft in a crescent with its back to the western shore of Plattsburgh, New York. It would have been the flagship Saratoga, then the Eagle, then the Ticonderoga, then the SS Preble. So the Brits must sail into his cupped hand to do combat. Commander MacDonough, wise in the ways of the seas, having learned them from Commodore Preble, sets out 2 kedge anchors, big heavy anchors, stern and bow, to hold the Saratoga in place with springs, literally, upon the cables, so that he could, by deploying the springs, swing and pivot the Saratoga a little bit in an arc to face the enemy. The Saratoga had 8 24-pound guns. They're known as the Long Toms for President Jefferson, and they're meant for long-range battling. When I say pounds, that's the weight of the ball, red hot, that could be fired by one of these. He has 6 42-pound and 12 32-pound carronades for the short-range fight. These are known as smashers. They're big-bellied, big-mouthed, short-range fighters. They belch shot and shell and scrap and lead at the foe at hundreds of miles an hour. They smash the ship. They smash sailors, too. The word of the day is no sailor wants to hear the smashers sing. The chief foe in the 4-ship British fleet with small craft that faces him is the frigate Confiance. So it is frigate Saratoga versus frigate Confiance. Skill versus skill. Frigate versus frigate. In all the careful research that Ron did for this day, and the accounts he found by the friends of Dr. Briggs, there was one word that's easily overlooked, but defines Dr. Briggs of that day. It is the word, no cockpit, unquote. Now, what? I said, no cockpit? The Saratoga had been pushed into service unfinished. No cockpit means no operating room. In American ships, picture the stern, the high officer's deck that slants down so that all the action of the ship can be kept under the eye of the commander. The cabin below that is the captain's cabin, the great cabin. And 1 or 2 levels below that is the surgeon's cockpit. It's where we get the word today. It's the most stable but most awful part of the ship. No natural light, 6 or 7 feet long, but only about 4.5 feet high. Not much taller than this stone. With a long, low table down the center. The ship's surgeon operated on his knees kneeling on pillows, if you're lucky, that are soon soaked with blood and sand and seawater and much worse. The surgeon's face is in the wound of the man he's treating, where the blood gushed and the bowels gave way and the bladder split, under swinging lanterns while above the battle goes on. Dr. Briggs, first, would have used a long implement, an iron hook, that would have hooked out the spurting arteries, which first he would have then sewn up with silk thread very, very quickly, looked for more. Then he would pick out the wood, the cloth, the loose pieces of bone, and wad up the wound with lint, probably, and linen. If the limb could not be saved, the assistant surgeon would bring out the saw, which looked more like a hacksaw with very sharp teeth than anything we could easily picture today. You were considered a good surgeon if with 3 strokes you could sever a limb. 1, 2, 3. And your patient's life is changed forever. Perhaps, if there was time, with his teeth he'd tear open a cartridge of black powder from the muskets and pour that into the wound and touch it off. Boom! Instant cauterization. No gloves, no gowns, no sterilization. Germs hadn't been invented yet. That's it. You hope that shock had put the patient out, or a shot of whiskey, or the wooden piece that you gave him to grip in his teeth. And then out with that one, in with the next, maybe slosh a bucket full of seawater down the length of that table and back to work. Dr. Briggs has no cockpit, but he has to do all those things we've just spoken about, working in the open air by the mainmast of the Saratoga, the widest part of the ship, but the most exposed. The decks are strewn with sand. The gunners fight barefoot. The sand is for traction and to absorb the blood. The ship is violently rocking. All around him are racing powder boys, little boys, who are carrying big silk sacks of gunpowder for the men at the guns. Their only defense is that they're small and swift, but they get wounded too. One lies here, not far from Commodore Preble, wounded in such a battle, never recovered. And as the cannon buck and break and haul at the chains, you have to stay out of the way, because it's not unlikely a cannon may break loose of its chain and come across the deck. We forget that the shock wave of a 24-pound shot passing you, missing you, the shock wave alone could take off your head at 200 plus miles an hour. It is not unusual for officers up on their stern deck to be hit by bowling heads of their own crew arcing out of the smoke on the deck, considered bad form to duck. You stand. The first British broadside from the Confiance disables and destroys all the Saratoga's starboard right side guns and kills or disables about a fifth of the crew. The danger from the iron shrapnel traveling at hundreds of miles an hour is equal only to the shattering of the ship's sides. When balls hit it, it shoots up fountains of long splinters like sharp javelins. They can lance through a man, and they do. In your opponent's cross trees, the British Marines have climbed up and are shooting down from the trees, the cross trees, at your officers, and you have Marines up doing the same. Many officers that Captain Briggs would have had to treat had puncture wounds that came in from the top and drove bits of their clothing down with the wound deep into the body. One such bullet or fragment strikes Dr. Briggs, assistant surgeon, the man who'd hold the legs of the howling men when they were sawed off, whose job it is to throw the arms and the legs over the side to keep them out of the way of Dr. Briggs. He's dead. And one fragment hits Dr. Briggs in his ankle. Now he's hobbling. He's bleeding into the sand on deck. Blood spurting from the wounded sailors. Blinded men flailing by him. And yet he works on. He's wearing their blood and his own too. And occasionally the red-hot cannonballs being fired by the Saratoga, which are heated, what's called a shot furnace, an actual fire in a brazier and a bed of sand on the deck. Those tip over, and red-hot cannonballs of your own side are rolling by you. Now this is serious business. Not far from here, the graves of Captain Blythe, British, and Captain Burrows, American, of the HMS Boxer and the USS Enterprise are right over there. They had engaged in a battle that Briggs must have known about in September 1813, right off the coast of Monhegan. In the first exchange of broadsides, Captain Blythe, British, is blown in two by a 24-pound cannonball that hits him in the gut. He is atomized instantly. In the return exchange of fire, Captain Burrows, the American, is hit by a shot that rips him open from his knees to his gut. There's no recovering from wounds like that. He refuses to be taken below and continues to direct what he can of the battle from his position under the mainmast. They are both buried side by side here. When the ships at last conclude the battle and the Americans win, it's to this port they are brought. To the credit of the Americans, they give an equal honor funeral to both the British and the American captain, and they lie together here today, just over the hill. Captain McDonough, at this point in the battle, cuts his cables, his anchor lines, and he uses those kedge anchors, the ones set out from the stern and the bow, to swivel the ship, literally turn it around in the middle of the battle by hauling upon the anchor chains. And having spun it around, he then blasts the British with his port, his left broadside. And that does it. Now there are 4 British ships, battered, sinking, and they surrender. The remaining officers are rowed across the debris-strewn, smoking sea to the Saratoga to give their swords in surrender to McDonough. Gentlemen, he says, return your swords to your scabbards. You are worthy of them. He would have been only a few feet from Dr. Briggs when all this took place. The victory at Plattsburgh halts the British attempt to take Lake Champlain and invade the United States from the north. It's over for the rest of the war. The very next day, the Battle of Baltimore occurs, when the British are turned back at Fort McHenry, and the British invasion of the United States south ends forever. Fort McHenry, Star-Spangled Banner, bombs bursting in air. Buried over there is ordinary seaman Richard Hill, a black man who was upon gunboat 49 in Baltimore Harbor, who saw the rocket's red glare. Richard Hill, buried here, not far from the captains, not far from Commodore. Well, you know, I like to think, well, first I should say, Within a handful of weeks, the diplomacy of John Quincy Adams in Belgium, in the town of Ghent, leads with diplomacy to the end of the War of 1812. But I like to think that Dr. Briggs, in a way, also helped. He helped, in a sense, save Maine from becoming New Ireland. Dr. Briggs turned 23 the week before the very day of the battle, 1 week to the day. His wounded foot never heals. He limps all his life. He is gone before he is 50. What memories, I wonder, kept him awake on the long nights? So, here we are now. So he rests here now, near the Commodore, near the two captains, near the United States paymaster for the War of 1812, whose stone is over there, near ordinary seaman Richard Hill, the African-American. All around him are the sailors and soldiers, his comrades from the War of 1812, all comrades sailing to the same swift sunrise. It's a quiet place. It's very pretty here. It's within sight and smell of the sea, and it makes one think. A forgotten war, well, but not forgotten for this one day. What part can one person play in their own tumultuous times? Dr. Briggs may have a lesson for us today in our own. Let us think on it. As Commander McDonough said 207 years ago, gentle man, doctor, at last, put up your healing instruments. You have proven worthy of them.
Great. Thank you. Very good.
Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate your being here to help us with all of these festivities and this celebration of Dr. John Briggs. I'm Janet Alexander. I'm president of Spirits Alive. Spirits Alive is an all-volunteer, nonprofit friends group of Eastern Cemetery, and our mission is to preserve, protect, and promote the cemetery as a whole. I keep getting sidetracked on individual stories, though, but that's kind of what brings us here today. We have, I think, an obligation to remember the individuals as well as the broad history that created our communities and our nation and our world. And it took an awful lot of people and individual effort to bring everybody here today. So I have some special thanks in order. The Mike Murray, who is the superintendent of cemeteries for Portland, and the city crew keep Spirits Alive supplied with materials we need. Our role in doing our mission is involves tours, conservation, as you may have seen when you came in, and we tend to get a little grubby, I'm sorry. The special tours in the fall, the winter lecture series, and special events such as this. In addition, I'd like to thank Martha Zemicki and the conservation crew, because they did a little bit of restoration work for the good Dr. Briggs earlier this year, so you can see the quality of their work. We have a number of representatives from the Rolling Thunder who were kind enough to come in and help us with the event today. The Daughters of the War of 1812 kind of started this whole thing with an inquiry almost a year ago now that led Ron Romano, who does all kinds of history and writing and genealogy and whatever, who discovered descendants of Dr. Briggs. And we have descendants from Steve and Cheryl Strout from Texas, and Dan and Susie Gibbs from Arizona, and they were kind enough to come all the way to Portland to help us celebrate. So in terms of the event itself, I'm happy to welcome you. I'm going to turn things over to Ron Romano to talk more about the story behind the stone. He will then pass the we'll say it's a baton to Herb Adams, who can talk more knowledgeably about the Battle of Plattsburgh, which is one of the major events for which Dr. Briggs is most known.
My turn?
And Ron can take it away.
Great, thank you. Thanks everybody for being here. As Janet said, we welcome you to Eastern Cemetery. It's the oldest public space in Portland, dating over 350 years. And because this is the final burying place for over 7,000 individuals, dating back 350 or more years, we often get questions from people doing their family genealogies, looking for their ancestors. And it's my job as part of the Spirits Alive group to do the research and to find out what we can about those folks that they're asking about, and then get answers as best we can back to them. And it was what I thought was going to be a very routine request about a year and a half ago from Wyoming. One of the daughters of the War of 1812 sent me a note looking to see if we had a Dr. John Briggs here and if there was a picture of the gravestone. It started this journey, which lasted until today. Happy to see it come to fruition here today with all of you in attendance. And it certainly got much more involved than I thought it was going to, but in a wonderful way. We've really got a great story to tell in Dr. Briggs, and of course his descendants are here to join us. So along the way, in putting the story of Dr. Briggs together, I met Steve Strout, who's here in the blue, and you'll see him in a few minutes. His cousin is here as well, as you know, and it was Steve that really supplied lots of family information to help me put the story together for Dr. Briggs. Briefly, Dr. Briggs was born in 1791 in Gorham, Maine. He married as a late teenager to Dolly Boynton, and at age 21 he entered the war service, joined the War of 1812 effort by becoming a surgeon's mate. And just 18 months after that, he found himself on the Saratoga on Lake Champlain and playing a key role in a very important battle that Herb is going to be telling us about. After the war, Dr. Briggs came back to Portland. He and Dolly had at least 10 children, perhaps 12. We still are working on the family tree. In 1832, their son William died. This remnant of a gravestone, the white marble you see here, is the final resting place of the son William, who died at age 5 in 1832. Dr. Briggs himself died in 1837. And he was 45 years old at the time. His cause of death is not known. A year later, he and Dolly's son Henry died at age 20 months. And it was at that point that this gravestone was put up to honor Dr. Briggs and his son Henry. So we'll take a quick look at it. The sun is shining behind it, making it a little bit challenging, so I'm going to help you. But it does say Dr. John P. Briggs, that's John Perkins Briggs, died July 21, 18. The date is wrong on the stone. It says 1838 at age 46. He was actually 45 and it was 1837. And the reason for the error on the stone is because son Henry died in 1838. So when the stone cutter put this together, made an assumption that Dr. Briggs had died the same year, and in fact it was a year earlier. So we do have the error. Because these were all hand-carved markers, they would not have made a correction. They wouldn't have thrown this away and started over. They had put too much time into it, so the errors remain. So what we have here is the grave site of Dr. Briggs. Henry, the infant son, is most likely here beside him, and the son William is here. But what you probably notice is there's an empty plot We think that's probably a daughter named Dorothea for her mother. There was a daughter who died in an accident by falling into a well and drowning in the 1830s. She was probably 14. My best guess is she's probably the one occupying this plot, but we do not have a formal record to put her there. The stone itself, besides having the date, there's an inscription here which is very hard to read today, but I'll read it to you. It reads, "Surgeon on board the flagship of Commodore McDonough in the Battle of Champlain, September 11th, 1814. Dr. Briggs' legacy certainly is his service to the country in the War of 1812, and again in a moment we'll hear from Herb about that. But he also, when he came back to Portland, he was actively practicing his medicine. He developed an elixir called Briggs Bitters, which was outlasted him by at least 2 decades. The advertisement for Briggs Bitters in the 1840s reads that the bitters could remove from the stomach and bowels any accumulation of bilious matter and give a vigorous and healthy tone to the organs of digestion. Now, 2 decades after his death, another company in Boston took over the Briggs Bitters elixir, and they added about a dozen more ailments that the bitters could supposedly correct. So over time, this got even more helpful to the citizens. So one more thing, Dolly, his wife, remarried a year after his death. She married the family lawyer who would help them settle his affairs. A few years later, the first of their children, adult children, moved to LaSalle, Illinois, and resettled there. 5 of their siblings would follow in the coming years. Ultimately, when Dolly's second husband died, she too went out to LaSalle and lived there. So the family was again reunited out in Illinois. That's where she died in the early 1850s. So at this point, I'm going to ask Herb to come up and tell us about the war and the battle, and then we'll do a placement of the medallion on the grave. So I'm going to ask Steve to come up. We have a War of 1812 medallion that was supplied by the daughters of the War of 1812, the woman from Wyoming. So we asked Steve to stick it in the ground, and so we're going to do that now. I'll just hand it to you and let you do that. It's a heavy thing. You pick the place. Great. Thank you. Anything you want to say?
I just want to thank Ron, and I'd actually like to thank my Uncle John and Aunt Margaret, who kept the family history and family records and family memorabilia that helped bring the story together. Thanks.
Thank you.